The following is a recording of a live questions and answers session with Chris McCann that took place on Monday, July 20th, 2015.
Hello and welcome in to eBible Fellowship Questions and Answers Time, where you can interact with us with your questions and comments related to the Bible, and we'll try to respond as well as possible by going to the Bible. And so, with our Bibles at the ready, it's now time to turn things over to our speaker, Chris McCann. Good evening, Chris.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to eBible Fellowship's Monday night question and answer program. Tonight, we're going to take a look at the Bible with any questions or comments that anyone may have. And each person is invited to share what's ever on your mind by contacting us in one of the ways that were mentioned at the beginning of the program, and we'll be glad to take your call. And I'll try to respond as much as possible by turning to the Bible, as the Bible is God's holy word. And it is there that we find truth. It's there that we find answers to our questions if the Lord is willing, if it's according to His will and plan to grant us understanding on the things that we're wondering about. But we're very thankful to God that we are living in a time when that is typically the case, that God is opening up much information from His Word, the Bible. See, I think we had a question from Pal Talk earlier, and the question is Luke 21, verse 34. Please explain what is meant by surfeiting and hearts overcharged. Let's take a look at Luke 21 and verse 34 says, "And take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and cares of this life, and so that day come upon you unawares." And the word, the Greek word translated as unawares, is only found twice in the New Testament, here and in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, where it's translated as sudden. Let me read that verse in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 3. "For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape." Well, the word sudden, it could be translated as unawares. And actually, literally, it's the Greek word is a compound word that means not seen. That's what the word literally means, and that's why in Luke 21 it's translated unawares, because if you don't see something, you're unaware of it. And yet the translators in 1 Thessalonians 5 had a dilemma. How can we translate this word not seen, or an unseen destruction, or an unaware destruction? What kind of destruction are people unaware of? What kind of destruction do people not see? And of course, they didn't have foresight or understanding of God's end time program to judge the world with a spiritual judgment. And what kind of judgment is a spiritual judgment? It's an unseen judgment, and people are taken in that judgment, and they're not aware of it. And so that's the word we have back here in Luke 21:34 that relates to Judgment Day. "So that day come upon you unaware." That is, if you get involved in allowing your hearts at any time to be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and cares of this life, well, it's language indicating you're not saved. And then Judgment Day comes upon you unawares, unseen, because you lack spiritual eyes to perceive it. You cannot understand what God has done, and therefore it was May 21, 2011 came and went, and you dismiss it. Your own physical eyes give all the evidence you need. Nothing happened. Rather than using spiritual sight, and that's how the child of God comes to the Bible. We see by eyes of faith, and we see the teaching of the Word of God. And is that far-fetched? Is that, that's just making an excuse? Or is that not the case with the judgment of God that came upon the church? It's the very same thing. God brought an unaware judgment, an unseen judgment upon the churches first. Judgment began at the house of God, and then he opened up the scriptures to reveal that he had done that. And his people saw the judgment of God. Remember, that's the language God uses in Matthew 24. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place where he ought not to be, then let those in Judea flee. And did anybody see with their physical eyes some abominable creature in the holy place? Of course not. None of us saw that. We saw with eyes of faith and understanding the teaching of the Bible. We did see that way the abomination of desolation, and that's why, who was Satan, and that's why God's people departed out and fled Judea. They got out of the church. And that's exactly how God works. The Bible's a spiritual book. He opens up the eyes of his people to see spiritual things. And now we come to Judgment Day, and God follows the pattern established with the judgment on the church. He brings about an unseen judgment. And if any are involved in these things, the unsaved, it's an indicator a person's unsaved, and they're not going to be able to see because they don't have those spiritual eyes to see. Now, specifically, what does it mean to have your hearts overcharged with surfeiting? What does overcharged or surfeiting mean? Well, we have some difficulty because both of these words are only found here in this verse. They're only used once in the New Testament, especially with the word surfeiting. It doesn't seem to have a closely related word that will help us, so I don't want to comment on that. But the Greek word translated as overcharged is Strong's number 925, and it's derived from 926. It's closely related, and that word 926 is a word translated heavy or grievous. For instance, in Matthew 23:4, it speaks of heavy burdens. And so I think that's the idea. Your hearts be heavy with surfeiting. The heavy burden of sin really, I think, is what's in view. But thank you for bringing up that verse. And let's go to first person on the phone. Welcome to our question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Hi, Chris. Good evening. How are you?
I'm doing well, by God's grace. Please go ahead.
I have two scriptures at which I would like you to look to see if and how they relate to this day of judgment in which we are. But
Okay.
before we get scriptures, I want to say something. By the mercy and tender compassion of the Lord, not to mention a hammer blow from his word, I've been brought to the realization that of my spiritual responsibility and obligation at this time, during this day of judgment. I did recognize through God's guidance in the scriptures that salvation is ended and we are in the day of judgment. And from studies received, that it's a strong likelihood that we might be raptured on October 7, 2015. However, I was very resistant to this feed in the sheep doctrine. I just felt that God was the one that is doing the feeding, seeing that He knows who His elect are. And there were many scriptures that I think testify to that, especially Psalm 23:5, where He says that God prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. But in the meantime, I was like restless and uneasy, and there's a amount of indecision. And then after seeing the downward spiral of family radio and friends going back to the church and preaching in the church and all of that, people that we were in with during the time leading up to May 21, you know, I sensed that something was wrong. And you know, after constant prayer and asking God to show me His truth and teach me and show me what He wants me to do, I think that He answered my prayer to say that, you know, this that I should be out there, you know, in obedience to His word and feeding the sheep. So, having said all that, I'm saying that I'm enlisting for the 11th hour shift of harvest reaping. Okay.
Well, that's good that you've come to that understanding, and there is still time. We have actually a substantial amount of time left to get busy with the task that God has given us. Now, there is an email that I can't remember that goes right to the people that are mailing out the tracts, but unfortunately I can't remember that, so I'll give you eBibleFellowship@juno.com, and if you send an email there with a request for tracts, I'll forward it on to the people that are sending them out to you or anyone listening. We are in this time where God is the one placing this heavy emphasis on feeding the sheep. And you know, I think that we just do what we can. We have today, and sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. So we go about the things we can do in just a single day, and we do leave the actual feeding to God because we don't know who they are. So we go about a task, and we share with those God brings us into contact with, and then He'll take it from there, and He'll reach His people and multiply His word. But did you have a question about the Bible?
I did have the verses that I want you to look at. Psalm 66:16.
All right.
And
Psalm
Isaiah 27:1.
Psalm 66:16 says, "Come and hear, all ye that fear God, and I will declare what He has done for my soul." And Isaiah 27 verse 1.
Yeah, I'm not saying that they're related, but I just want to see how they relate to this time.
Isaiah 27 verse 1. In that day Jehovah, with His sore and great and strong sword, shall punish Leviathan, the piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent, and He shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. Well, this verse in Isaiah is speaking of Judgment Day and God destroying or putting down Satan. And that's what happened at the beginning of Judgment Day. the Lord Jesus Christ took the kingdom of Satan. He, just as Cyrus took Babylon, Christ came as a thief in the night and took the world from Satan and removed him from all rule in the world and in the churches. Now Christ is the supreme ruler, although he's ruling with a rod of iron, but is just waiting to be destroyed. And he still exists at this time. He exists and he can cause trouble as before in going into a church or with an individual or whatever he does. But he has no official capacity any longer in the world or in the church. Now in Isaiah or in Psalm 66, I'm not sure of the context of this psalm, but come and hear, all ye that fear God, and I will declare what he has done for my soul. And that sounds, well, it sounds like the heart desire of every child of God. We want to share with others what God has done for us. It's similar to the man who was lunatic, where Christ said, go and publish what great things God has done for you. And then he went and published what great things Jesus had done for him. And so I think this could relate to any time in history, during the church age, during the Great Tribulation, the latter rain, or now. We can tell people what great things God has done for our soul. But thank you for calling and sharing. And let's go to the next person on the phone. Welcome to our Monday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Hi, Chris. Could you please read Matthew 24, verses 5 through 8, please?
Matthew 24, verse 5. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. Ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there shall be famines, and pestilences, and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows.
I was looking at a few of these words in these verses, and I just want to talk to you about that, and then maybe you could put together possibly what these verses mean. In verse 6, where it says, see that ye not be troubled, that word troubled is found in 2 Thessalonians 2, right before where Satan takes his seat in the temple of God. And then in verse 7, where it refers to famines and earthquakes, would the famine be a famine of hearing of the word of God, and earthquakes, being May 21st, and then indicating in verse 8, all of these are the beginning of sorrows. And basically my question is this group of verses really speaking of the time of both the end of the church age and where we are now? Because you mentioned the other day about nation against nation, also in kingdom of kingdom.
Well, it could be. It could be. There's, I think this is found in 3 of the Gospels. In Luke, the placement is a little different. And so I think it has to be carefully worked out so that we can explain Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and to see how God is saying this. That's interesting about the word troubled, or be not troubled. But I don't think I can say right now, exactly what's in view here, and especially where it says these are the beginning of sorrows. So that phrase it defines the previous couple of verses. So I think we have to carefully look at that phrase too, and I haven't been able to do that. But thank you.
Just last thing to throw in there, Chris, is that if that is the case, that it might be referring to that, then I found it interesting if it was this time frame, which it would include now, the fact that at the end of verse 6, but the end is not yet. If that's the case, that would be an interesting thought in there as well. That's just a side note.
Yeah, we've typically, as we've looked at these verses in the past, we've read this and we've sort of applied a natural understanding that, well, God is just telling us about the history of the world, and in the world there's wars, there's rumors of wars, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, there's famines, pestilence, and then that phrase, but the end is not yet, which we had thought previously just meant that when you see World War II, or when you see World War I, or these wars of men, that doesn't relate to the end of the world. It's just typical, the typical occurrence of what will happen in the world. But that is basically a natural understanding of those verses, and I think it's pretty clear in verse 7, nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom is speaking of the kingdom of God and the kingdom of Satan. And it does, I think, call for a review and to look more carefully, and that's an idea that you're bringing up that we should look at. But thank you.
Okay, thank you
for bringing up these verses. And let's go to the next person on the phone. Welcome to our question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Good evening, Chris. I'm glad to hear your voice. It looks like you're feeling better with your voice by God's grace. Chris, could you please read 1 Peter 2:23 and Psalm 106? There's many verses for my question. They actually go from verse 6 to 20. Obviously, you're not going to read all of them, but I could ask the question, and you would understand what I'm trying
let's
to
read
to
1
go
Peter 2:23, and then I'll go to Psalm 106. And
Yes.
Okay, in 1 Peter 2:23, let's back up a little bit. Verse 21.
Okay.
For even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, they should follow his steps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who, when he was reviled not again, when he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. And then Psalm 106.
Yes, 106, starting from verse 6 through 20. Actually, I was listening to the Bible reading, and then I went to look at the psalm because this psalm particularly caught my attention. And I do understand that there is a righteous indignation. God has a perfect indignation, like God has a perfect jealousy that is not to be understood in human terms as we understand it. And so I understand that there's righteous indignation against evil. However, in these verses from 6 to 20, why do we read of this lament of bad wishes, like imprecations against the evil, a plea for retributions against the enemy, a desire, a wish for death of their family? Shouldn't we, as followers of Christ, the verse that you just read in 1 Peter 2:23, really, when reviled, not to revile when physically attacked or verbally attacked by the enemies of God?
You know, it's interesting when we read of God's judgments I don't know if we're fully understanding exactly what God has done. For instance, if we go to Psalm 136, which is that psalm where God will make a statement, and then the concluding part of the statement will say, "For his mercy endureth forever." And in verse 1, "will give thanks unto Jehovah, for he is good, for his mercy endureth forever." Give thanks unto the God of gods, for his mercy endureth forever. So we understand that, but then as it continues, it goes on to say in verse 10, "To him that smote Egypt in their firstborn, for his mercy endureth forever." And we wonder, what does smiting Egypt and their firstborn have to do with God's mercy? And it goes on to say in verse 15, "But overthrew Pharaoh and his host in the Red Sea, for his mercy endureth forever." And in verse 18, "and slew famous kings, for his mercy endureth forever." Then he names some of the kings he slew. And so we see that judgments upon Egypt, upon Pharaoh, upon various kings that were enemies, relate to God's mercy. And it also relates to the deliverance of the people of God from Egypt. They were delivered because God smote the firstborn, because he destroyed Pharaoh and the Egyptians in the Red Sea. This delivered the people of God, and so it relates to the mercy of God, to his bestowing mercy upon his people. God had to smite the wicked. And I think that would be the idea, that God must smite the wicked, and through the smiting of Satan and through the judging of Satan's kingdom, God brings forth his people who enter into the new heaven and new earth. So his mercy endureth forever. And the judgments of God tie in to his grace and mercy to his people, because all things work together for good to the people of God. And I think that would be the reason. Now, remember, the author of Psalm 106 is God. God's the author. It doesn't have a heading at the beginning of the psalm, but God wrote all the psalms. He wrote the whole Bible, and so God is the one who is expressing these things. Maybe he moved David or Asaph or whoever to write it, but God's the one who is declaring these things.
Yeah, thank you so much. That makes so much sense, and I understand it very well. Thank you, Chris. Good night.
Well, thank you for calling and sharing those scriptures. And let's go to the next person on the phone. Welcome to our Monday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Hi, Chris. Could you please read Zechariah 8 verses 12 and 13?
Zechariah?
Yes, 8 verses 12 and 13. And Jeremiah 42 verses 18.
In Zechariah 8:12, "For the seed shall be prosperous, the vine shall give her fruit, and the ground shall give her increase, and the heavens shall give their dew. And I will cause the remnant of this people to possess all these things. And it shall come to pass that as you were a curse among the heathen, O house of Judah and house of Israel, so will I save you, and you shall be a blessing. Fear not, but let your hands be strong." And then Jeremiah 42.
Yes, verse 18.
"For thus saith Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, as mine anger and my fury hath been poured forth upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so shall my fury be poured forth upon you, when ye shall enter into Egypt. Ye shall be an execration, an astonishment, and a curse, and a reproach. Ye shall see this place no more.
Yes, are these verses talking about the blessings on God's remnant, his elect that did go into the heathen nation, and his fury with those that wanted to remain in the church?
In Jeremiah 42, there were a group of Jews that were left in the land under Gedaliah the governor, and that was rebellion against God, because God had declared through the prophet Jeremiah that all the Jews were to go into captivity, but Gedaliah was set up by the Babylonians, and there were people, armies, remnant of the armies of Judah that came in from the field, and they came to Jerusalem, and they were told to submit to the Babylonians, which would have been according to the will of God, but they feared to submit. And at first, though, they are called the remnant in the book of Jeremiah. And at first they come to Jeremiah and they say, tell us the word of the Lord. Whatever the Lord says, we will do. And so Jeremiah goes to the Lord, but God does not answer him right away. I think it was a 10-day period before God returned answer to Jeremiah. You know, if you're a prophet, you can't dictate to God when he would bring revelation to you. You had to wait on the Lord. And so God waited 10 days because this is at the point where Gedaliah was slain and some Babylonians were slain. And it really caused that remnant to fear what the Babylonian army would do when they return. And so God is trying them and testing them during this 10-day period. And finally, the Lord speaks to Jeremiah and tells them they should stay and submit to the Babylonians. But as soon as Jeremiah tells them that, they say, you speak falsely. The Lord has not told you, because they were unsaved all along. Now this group, which was identified as a remnant, would relate to the Reformed churches, the evangelical churches. The church age had ended back in 1988, but there was a remnant of churches that gave the appearance of faithfulness, and so they used all the right words. They understood about election, just like this remnant of Jews that were left in the land were saying all the right words at first to Jeremiah. Whatever the Lord says, we will do. Sounds just like a child of God. But as God applied the pressure and increased the temperature of the fire, they revealed their true character, that they were not true believers, and they wanted to flee to Egypt. And so God pronounces judgment upon them, and if they flee to Egypt, the wrath of God would follow them. They were not humbling themselves to the will of God. And of course, what the spiritual picture of this would be, you can't stay in the land and be a faithful church, a Reformed church, and try to be as faithful to the Word of God as possible. No, it's not going to happen. You must come out and leave, and leave the churches and congregations, and these churches rebelled against God, even though they were attempting to give the appearance of being the remnant. And I think that's what's in view here. But thank you.
Thank you
for bringing up those verses. And let's go to our last caller tonight. Welcome to our Monday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Hi, Chris. We know that October 7, 2015 lands on the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles in the Hebrew calendar, the 23rd day of the 7th month. But in 2011, when we misunderstood the 5 months, took it literal, and it brought us to October 21, 2011 as the end of the world, was it a snare set up by God deliberately that it also seemed to land on the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles?
Yeah, that's a good question. And
Because
God
the Bible
does.
says, it shall rain snares upon the wicked.
Yes, in the Psalms it says that, and in Luke 21 it says, after mentioning that day will come upon you unawares, the next verse, verse 35, says, for as a snare shall come on all them that dwell in the face of the whole earth. And just look at how God set this up. First of all, he locks in May 21, 2011. 7,000 years from the flood, and then May 21, 2011 has the underlying Hebrew calendar date of 2/17, which is the exact date that the flood began 7,000 years earlier in the days of Noah. And May 21, 2011 also happens to be the exact 23 or 23rd year of the Great Tribulation, the 8400th day, the day you would expect for God to bring judgment. And then that day, not some other day, that day has 2/17 as the Hebrew calendar date. Well, then, when we look at the flood account, we find that God emphasizes 5 months, because it says in Genesis chapter 7 in verse 24, and the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. And then, just so it wouldn't be missed, it says in verse 3 of Genesis 8, and the waters return from off the earth continually, and after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated, and the ark rested in the 7th month on the 17th day of the month. So God says it was 150 days, and then he says the day that the ark rested was the 17th day of the 7th month. Well, the flood began on the 17th day of the 2nd month, and anybody can see 2/17 through 7/17, a very even, exact 5-month period is emphasized with the flood. Well, then we read in Revelation 9, in a chapter dealing with Judgment Day, God talks of the sun being darkened and opening up the bottomless pit, and torment being unleashed upon the earth for how long? 5 months.
5 months.
So now we have that information from the Bible, from the very day that the flood began, 2/17. God emphasizes a 5-month period to 7/17. Then we have Revelation 9 speak of this mysterious judgment that lasts 5 months. And as Mr. Camping used to say, lo and behold, on May 21, 2011, if we go 5 months in our Gregorian calendar, you go June, July, August, September, October, 21, a nice even space, just like 2/17 to 7/17, and October 21, 2011 happens to be the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, which all the other information in the Bible comes into play as God speaks of the resurrection at the last day and so forth. And so we were set up. God's people were set up. You know, Jeremiah, in the book of Jeremiah, says at one point that thou hast deceived me, and I was deceived. God set up his people in order that we be convinced that this is how it's all going to work out. This will be Judgment Day. There'll be then a 5-month period. But we were wrong. And we take responsibility for that. You know, it's always man's responsibility to understand truth. Why don't we understand truth? Why do we lack understanding of anything in the Bible? Because we're sinners. Because of our sin, we have thick skulls, and it's very hard for the truth to penetrate. That's why it takes God to open our understanding. But we're always accountable. We're always responsible. And when we lack understanding, yes, God's ultimately the one doing it, but it's our responsibility. We misunderstood, and we thought the 5 months would be literal because everything pointed that way. There it is, October 21, the last day of Feast of Tabernacles. And even though when you add 8,400 days, and that 5 months worked out to 153 days, you get 8553, and that basically means nothing. The total number of days of the combined judgment on the church and then on the world. But it's not until we go beyond October 21 that now we're forced to do what we were forced to do after May 21. Let's return to the Bible and see what happened. And we see, well, the spiritual judgment came May 21, 2011. And then, this is amazing. This is really amazing. God shows us a chapter in Revelation 14 and gives us a number in the context of Judgment Day. 1,600 furlongs. And when we understand that to be 1,600 days, we go from the beginning of Judgment Day, May 21, 2011, and into the future 4 years, 4 months, and 16 days, which is 4 times 4 days. And we come to October 7th, 2015, which just happens to be the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles. The very day we expected the world to end, the resurrection to take place back 4 years ago. And here it is, but this time it's also the 10,000th day of overall judgment. And that's a number that points to completeness. And so we actually have a much better likelihood that this date will be correct than October 21 of 2011. And we also are on sturdier footing because we're not taking a number from the book of Revelation, the 5 months, and understanding it literally. No, the 5 months represents the entire prolonged period of judgment. The whole likely 1,600 days was typified by 5 months. And so now everything falls into place, and actually we have more harmony. You know, if you go back to studies Mr. Camping did many years ago about the last day. The last day. He used to teach the rapture and the resurrection were simultaneous with the end of the world on the last day. But for various reasons, he began to teach the rapture would take place May 21, 2011, because after all, how could God leave the elect on the earth to go through the judgment? And therefore, the rapture was separated from the resurrection. Where Mr. Camping began to teach, the rapture will occur first. That's what the earthquake was all about. And then 5 months later will be the resurrection. And yet now we understand, no, it's all going to happen on the last day of the prolonged period of judgment. Rapture, resurrection, end of the world. All simultaneous once again. So we actually have a better understanding of things than we had previously. And, that doesn't typically happen. Actually, I can't think of that happening with anything else. Normally, when you get something wrong, and if it is wrong, and you go back to the Bible and it brings correction, well, then you go into normally a different direction. And yet this has brought correction where we've been able to maintain the biblical calendar of history, and we've been able to use many of the supporting doctrines and scriptures that many other things have been built upon. But thank you for calling and sharing that. I would like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And Lord willing, we'll have another question and answer, audio question and answer this Friday. Please remember, during the week on Facebook, we have a group, Sunday Open Q&A, where you can post a question or comment at any time. And we have a set time, 12 to 12:30 p.m., where those questions will be addressed. And all are welcome there. But for now, I'll say good night. And please keep the team in Sao Paulo, Brazil, in prayer. Pray also for God's elect there, that the Lord would bless his people. And may you have a good night, and may the Lord's perfect will be done.
And thanks for joining us again for eBible Fellowship's Questions and Answers Time with your speaker, Chris McCann. You can join us for these questions and answers sessions Sunday afternoon following Sunday studies and Monday and Friday evenings following the Monday and Friday evening studies. Until next time, may the Lord's perfect will be done.